You have 9 seconds. None of them know that yet. The convoy has been rolling since before first light. 80 vehicles stretched along National Highway 1, east of Saigon, the kind of column that swallows the road as far as the eye can reach in either direction. 20 miles of open country between here and the Blackhorse base camp. The morning presses down warm and overcast. November in 3rd Corps, the air carrying the particular density of humidity that makes distances feel closer and silences feel louder. 8, 7. The lieutenant standing in the commander's hatch of the lead escort vehicle is watching the tree line. He has watched this tree line and 100 others like it since September. The tree line has never answered him. 6, 5. His radio crackles with a message from squadron headquarters. Coordinates, suspected enemy activity, delivered in the tone of something that has probably already come to nothing. He asks for more information. There is none. 4, 3. He radios his lead ACAV to close the gap, orders his gunners to watch the south shoulder, turns to verify what the air controllers circling overhead can see. 2. From inside a stand of banana trees on the south side of the road, 15 feet from the asphalt, a 75mm recoilless rifle that has been waiting for 3 days tracks the column. 1. What you are about to hear happened on November 20th, 1966, on a stretch of Highway 1 near the village of Ap Hung Nghia, 50 kilometers east of Saigon. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the Blackhorse, had been in Vietnam for exactly 2 months. This was their first major battle. A Viet Cong regiment had spent weeks engineering a 1,500-meter killing zone to destroy a convoy exactly like this one. 80 vehicles, 9 escorts, a ratio they had studied and found favorable. They had positioned 5 heavy weapons and infantry across both sides of the road. They had done everything right. This is the story of what they missed, and what it cost both sides to find out. Before we go any further, if someone in your life wore a uniform, this channel is for them. Subscribe so their story stays alive. Hit the bell so the next one finds you before the algorithm buries it. These men gave everything on that highway. The least we can do is remember. It is 10:25 in the morning when the lieutenant receives 2 things at once: a report of incoming fire from his forward vehicle and a direct, unobstructed view of what is already burning on the road ahead. He has a decision to make, and the window for making it is measured in seconds. Stopping the column means 80 unarmored trucks frozen on a 1,500-meter killing floor. Running it through means driving every driver in that convoy into fire that is already working. His hand is moving toward the radio before the decision is fully formed. He has done this drill 1,000 times. The difference is that this time, the banana grove is on fire. That lieutenant was William Keltner. And to understand what he chose in the next 4 minutes, you need to know where the Blackhorse had come from, and what had been asked of it before a single round was ever fired in Vietnam. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment arrived in Vietnam in September 1966. In the 5 months between their deployment alert and their arrival in country, the regiment had trained with a specificity that bordered on obsession. The leaders understood what road escort in 3 Corps would require. Not the exact terrain, not the specific enemy formation, but the essential shape of the problem. Long columns, narrow roads, prepared positions, and an adversary who had been running ambushes on those roads since before American advisors had a formal name for the war. The drills were deliberate and repetitive. When ambushed on a road, You do not stop. You do not reverse. You push the column forward through the killing zone, trading the longest possible exposure for the shortest. The ACAVs fire in all directions. Thin-skinned vehicles move out. Armor turns back to roll the flanks. You run it through. The doctrine was clean. The doctrine was right. And the doctrine, as Keltner knew, demanded that a man drive toward the fire at precisely the moment every nerve in his body was issuing the opposite instruction. He was a cavalry officer running convoy escort on a road the Viet Cong had contested for years. He had done this route before. He had received intelligence warnings before that resolved into nothing. Tree lines that gave back only heat and the sound of insects and the smell of standing water in the paddies beyond the shoulder. He had 9 ACAVs, M113 armored personnel carriers that had been modified for Vietnam with gun shields and side-mounted M60 machine guns capable of delivering withering fire while keeping pace with wheeled traffic. 9 of them, 80 trucks. The arithmetic was not comfortable. He had made peace with the arithmetic in September and was maintaining that peace in November. The week before deployment, a sergeant older than most of the officers, a man who had done Korea and still moved like someone waiting for a thing he couldn't name, had pulled Keltner aside after an exercise. "The training is right," he said. "Trust the training when your brain quits on you." Not inspiring, not designed to be. It was practical advice from a man who had seen the specific failure mode it was trying to prevent. Keltner had filed it somewhere near the floor of his thinking. It was there now, on Highway 1, with the radio active. The 2 men who would carry the weight of this story alongside Keltner have no surnames in the record that survived. The Army documents them by their vehicles, C-18 and C-13. And what those vehicles did is documented in enough detail to know exactly what kind of men had to be inside them. The driver of C-18 was 2nd Platoon, somewhere in his mid-20s, a veteran of the same training cycle and the same autumn patrols on the same highway. He had ridden this road enough times to know how the banana grove looked from the commander's hatch, the way the vegetation thickened at the south shoulder as the road crested the slight rise before Ap Hung Nghia, the way the shadows in that grove ran deeper than the rest of the jungle line. He carried something in his kit that the sources don't preserve. There is always something, a letter, a photograph, the kind of folded thing that doesn't need explanation to be important. Whatever it was in his kit that morning. The driver of C-13 was 2 vehicles behind him in the column. A specialist in a crew of 5, assigned to escort duty on what had been briefed as a standard resupply run. He had run the counter-ambush drill enough times for it to lose its severity. The specific erosion of repetition, where you practice a thing until it feels theoretical, until the only way to understand that it was never theoretical is to be inside the real version of it. He was about to understand that. The situation on November 20th was this: Operation Atlanta, the regiment's first sustained operation in Vietnam, had been built around doing exactly what the Army needed done: keeping Highway 1 and Highway 2 open through 3 provinces northeast of Saigon, a region that the Viet Cong's 5th Division had treated as controlled territory for years. The Blackhorse had been clearing jungle, running roadrunner patrols, establishing their base camp south of Xuan Loc. They had fought smaller contacts. They had not yet met a prepared battalion-level ambush on a major supply convoy. That morning, a large resupply column was making the run from Long Binh, the kind of convoy a regiment needs to sustain itself in the field. Supplies of every description, the ordinary weight of a mechanized unit. The column had grown through the night. as late departing elements attached themselves to the rear. It was longer than planned, slightly less organized than ideal, moving on an intelligence picture that was fragmentary at best. The warning came from squadron headquarters. The coordinates were passed. Keltner radioed his vehicles. All but the lead ACAV answered. A few seconds later, the lead reported incoming fire and asked permission to return. Even as Keltner gave permission, his own vehicle came alongside the edge of the banana grove, and the full shape of the morning arrived all at once. If you served with a squad that became your family, share their story below. Not the official version, the one you actually lived. This channel is built on those accounts. The next video might be about someone you knew. The Dong Nai Regiment, the 274th Regiment of the Viet Cong's 5th Division, had not selected this stretch of Highway 1 casually. They had selected it the way experienced men select a position, because it was exactly suited to what they needed it to do. Their commander had been watching American convoy patterns for weeks. Highway 1 through this section of the Three Corps was not simply a road. It was the logistical artery of the Blackhorse operation, the route through which the regiment sustained its base camp, its patrols, its capacity to project force throughout the region. Interrupt it, and you did more than destroy trucks. You demonstrated, in terms that required no interpretation, that the new American mechanized regiment with its armored vehicles and helicopters and its stated intention to own these roads could be stopped. Stopped on a road it was supposed to protect. Stopped publicly, during daylight, 50 kilometers from Saigon. The message would travel faster than any official report, to every hamlet and province and rival unit that was watching to see what the Blackhorse would actually be. The site near Ap Hung Nghia had been chosen because the terrain did the work. The killing zone ran 1,500 meters between the western edge of the jungle and the outskirts of the village, long enough that no vehicle entering from the west could see the far end, long enough that a column of 80 trucks could be entirely inside the zone before the rearmost driver knew there was a fight. The banana grove along the south shoulder provided concealment for the entry weapon, a 75mm recoilless rifle positioned 15 feet from the asphalt, close enough to the road that the backblast would be audible to anyone standing on the pavement when it fired. A second 75mm dominated the eastern half of the zone from a slope beyond the grove. A 57mm recoilless rifle held a hill 300 meters east, commanding the middle approaches. An 82mm mortar was dug deep in the southern jungle, far enough back to survive the first minutes of air response. Heavy machine guns were positioned inside huts distributed through the zone, not as primary weapons against the convoy, but as anti-aircraft positions, because the commander was not naive about what would come from the sky after the first round fired. He ran his command post from a crest 500 meters west of Ap Hung Nghia, with line of sight to the entire zone. He had also deployed infantry in the tall grass on the north side of the road, the side where men jumping from burning trucks would instinctively go. He had looked at the most predictable American survival response and placed riflemen exactly in the path of it. The men holding those positions had been there for days. The nights along Highway 1 in November were cool and wet, the ground fog collecting between the road shoulder and the tree line, and the waiting in those positions was the hardest part. Not the danger of the fight, but the specific discipline of perfect stillness before it. No movement, no smoke. Every routine air patrol that crossed overhead during those days passed over a stretch of road that looked exactly like every other stretch of road in Three Corps. The positions were invisible. The plan was sound. They were not wrong to believe in it. The 274th Regiment had fought American forces before. They had studied what helicopters could do, what jets did to unprepared positions, what the M113 armored personnel carrier could deliver in firepower. Their intelligence described the ACAV as a lightly armored transport with a machine gun, fast, but not a fighting vehicle in the sense that would complicate their calculations. The modified M113s of the Blackhorse, with their reinforced gun shields and side-mounted M60s and grenade launchers, were not yet in their picture as a distinct category of threat. That gap would matter. What the commander knew, and knew with the confidence of a man who had done the arithmetic repeatedly, was the ratio. 80 trucks and 9 escorts on a 1,500-meter killing zone, with 5 heavy weapons and 2 battalions of infantry. In every version of that calculation, the Dong Nai Regiment came out ahead. He had designed his plan around one fundamental assumption, that the Americans would behave under ambush the way infantry behaves under ambush, that they would stop, take cover, wait for the ambush to complete itself, and call for help that would arrive too late to change the outcome. He had prepared meticulously for every predictable reaction to his fire. He had not prepared for a regiment that had spent 5 months training to do the opposite, to treat the ambush itself as the signal to accelerate, not stop, to drive toward the guns rather than away from them, to behave, in short, as though the survival calculus had been reversed by doctrine and held in place by repetition. On the crest west of the village, he watched the column approach the entry point of his killing zone. The morning was clearing slightly. Below him, the banana grove was still. The positions were ready. The timing was his. If you're watching this, you already belong to a smaller group than you think. People who understand that military history isn't about tactics and hardware. It's about human beings making impossible decisions under impossible conditions. Subscribe and join the ones who refuse to forget. The first round from the 75mm at the western entry point hit C-22, the lead ACAV, while Keltner was still processing the request to return fire. The timing meant the ambush had opened almost exactly as designed, with the lead vehicle inside the zone and the column strung out behind it on the approach. Almost exactly. That word changes everything, because half the convoy had already passed through the entry point, because Keltner's alert, barely in time, too late to stop the column but enough to shift the posture, had gotten his escorts firing into the tree line before the heavy weapons fully joined in, because the Dong Nai Regiment had been denied the one thing that makes a prepared ambush decisive: complete surprise. Keltner ordered the run. The doctrine had a single instruction for this moment, and he applied it without hesitation. His ACAVs laid fire into both sides of the road. The convoy kept moving, not because the drivers weren't afraid, but because the alternative, stopping on that road at that moment, was a form of dying that carried no delay. The drivers who had been in country long enough to have formed opinions about survival did the math in real time and came to the same conclusion Keltner had already reached. The killing zone had a texture that no training exercise had reproduced. The road surface was dry red laterite dust, and the first detonations threw it into the air, and it settled onto everything, onto exposed skin, into the narrow space between gun shield and weapon, into the back of the throat in a way that made men cough and keep firing. The jungle on the south side held something beneath the smell of rotting vegetation, the particular odor of a position occupied for days by men who could not leave it to take care of themselves. The smell of patience, the smell of preparation sitting in the ground, waiting to close. From the eastern slope, the second 75mm opened on the middle of the column. A truck carrying a heavy load had fallen behind the vehicle ahead of it, creating a gap in the convoy's center. The recoilless rifle found the lead truck in the delayed section. The gasoline tank exploded instantly, killing the two men in the cab before the truck finished moving. It lurched into the north ditch, its trailer still on the pavement, and a column of thick black smoke drove straight up into the overcast sky like a marker. For the men in the following trucks, who had not yet been in a major firefight, that column was the moment the morning became something else entirely. C-18 was already in trouble. It had taken 2 hits, one on the loading ramp that the armor had absorbed, one on the right side that started a fire and sent shrapnel through the crew compartment, wounding the commander. The vehicle was burning. The crew was still fighting. The .50 caliber and both M60s were working, feeding rounds into the banana grove at a rate that men in those positions had not anticipated from a vehicle that was visibly on fire. The Dong Nai commander, watching from the hilltop, registered the anomaly. The ACAV was not behaving like a damaged transport. It was behaving like something that intended to keep fighting until it physically could not. He hadn't encountered this before. He didn't have a prepared response for it. He didn't know yet that the Ho Nai outpost had already flashed word to the Blackhorse Operations Center. The relief force was forming. The wounded commander of C-18 radioed his situation to Keltner. Then a recoilless rifle round hit the engine compartment and the vehicle began to die in earnest. The commander, shrapnel in his body, gave the evacuation order. The crew dragged him from the hatch and carried him into the tall grass on the north side of the road, the side with lighter fire, the side where the next several minutes offered a slightly different set of probabilities. The driver stayed. He got the burning vehicle started. He turned it back toward the heaviest concentration of fire on the south side of the road, not because any order authorized it, not because the doctrine had an instruction for this specific configuration of burning vehicle and open road, but because there were men in the grass behind him and a burning ACAV moving unpredictably toward the enemy line was a problem that demanded attention. He was, in those minutes, a decoy made of fire and steel, and a decision that existed in the space below language. 400 meters down the highway, one round out of the thousands being fired at the moving vehicle found the driver. C-18 stopped. What C-13's driver had been watching from 2 vehicles back was this. C-18 hit and burning, the lead truck in flames with its trailer blocking the road. 3 trucks immediately ahead of him still in the killing zone, taking direct fire from the banana grove. His ACAV commander was wounded. His gunner was dead, killed when the round destroyed the right gun shield. He himself had taken shrapnel. The engine compartment had been hit, and C-13 was beginning to burn. He interposed the vehicle between the trucks and the fire. He drove it past the burning trailer blocking the road, past the remaining trucks, 1,500 meters beyond the end of the killing zone before anyone called for a stop. Only then did the surviving crew abandon C-13. It exploded minutes later. The 10 seconds of silence that followed were the strangest 10 seconds of the entire battle. For the first time since 10:25, the men in the ditches could hear the sound underneath the sound of the fight. Jet fighters, already circling, already being directed. A forward air controller on a routine administrative flight had seen the smoke from the first burning truck and had contacted the Blackhorse Operations Center within minutes of the first shot. 3 F-100 Super Sabres were seconds from their first run. The recoilless rifle on the east slope fired into one of the stalled trucks. Then again. Methodical work. 4 rounds in sequence, each finding a new vehicle. The Viet Cong gunners were still working their plan. From the hilltop, the commander watched and began recalculating. The ACAVs had fought through his entire killing zone, on fire, returning fire, and had not stopped until they were physically incapable of continuing. That was not what the intelligence picture had described. That was information that changed what the next hour could look like. The men in the north ditches were doing their own calculations. No ACAVs remained in the killing zone. The burning trucks were landmarks now, rather than threats. The standard completion of a Viet Cong ambush at this stage, once the armored escorts were out of the zone and the column was frozen, was a ground assault across the road. The men in the ditches knew this. They were crouched in mud that smelled of rice, paddy drainage, and old grass, watching the south shoulder, fully expecting the infantry to rise from the grass and come. The infantry did not come. What came instead was the Huey gunship, the only one operational with the 1st Squadron that day, which had been monitoring Keltner's frequency and was already turning to make its first run before anyone formally requested it. The silence after C-13 exploded was not peace. It was the brief interval between what the ambush had done and what came next. An interval that neither side could use fully, because neither side yet knew exactly what it had. For the men in the north ditches, it was a moment to breathe and take account. The burning truck trailers had become reference points, columns of smoke visible for miles that let the 2 forward air controllers and the gunship find the zone from altitude. Around those columns, the scattered men of the convoy were beginning to organize themselves into something that had at least the shape of a position. Some were wounded. Some were helping the wounded. Some were doing the basic mathematics of a firefight from a ditch, which requires you to expose part of yourself to do effectively, and which these men were doing regardless. Someone checked the man beside him. Someone gave account of who was where. Someone said something that made the man nearest him exhale through his nose, in a way that, under different circumstances, would have been a laugh. They were alive. They did not yet know for how long. The recoilless rifle on the east slope fired again before they had finished processing that fact. On the south side, in the grass 50 meters from the road, a Viet Cong fighter who had been positioned to intercept dismounting Americans had made no move. His orders were to wait for the signal to assault, the completion of the ambush, the final collapse of the American position. The signal had not come. The ACAVs had moved when they should have stopped. The helicopters had arrived faster than the pre-battle briefing had indicated. He lay in the grass and watched the smoke and waited for an order that was taking longer than it should. Keltner was east of the killing zone with one functioning ACAV, a stretch of burning highway behind him, and a developing picture of what he had and what he didn't. He had one vehicle, air support arriving, a relief column somewhere behind him whose arrival he was calculating in real time, and wounded men scattered across 1,500 meters of road whom he could reach on the radio, but not physically. He didn't have any ACAVs still functional inside the zone, a clean count of casualties, certainty about whether the ground assault was still coming, or a doctrine that told him what to do next. He drove back in. This is the moment that sits at the center of the entire story, and it is worth holding before moving past it. There was no order that required it. There was no regulation that demanded one ACAV drive unescorted back into a killing zone that had just destroyed 2 others. The men in the ditches were not yet in immediate danger of overrun. The ground assault had not materialized. Air was arriving. The relief force was close. Keltner could have held at the eastern edge and coordinated from there, and been correct to do so. He chose differently. What would you do? Not in theory. Not with the benefit of this account and 60 years of distance. In that specific moment, one vehicle, a burning road ahead, wounded men audible on the radio but unreachable. What do you choose? Not the training answer, not the doctrine answer, the real one, made in the actual seconds before it calcifies into a decision. Don't answer yet. Keltner already answered. He drove C-10 west to C-13's burning hulk first, directed its crew to stay with C-13's surviving wounded until medevac arrived, then kept going, alone at top speed, radioing for the helicopter before he finished the maneuver. A Blackhorse helicopter already overhead and monitoring his frequency responded immediately. He pressed on. 10 Viet Cong broke from cover and crossed the road directly in front of him. Both sides opened fire simultaneously. 5 of the 10 went down. The others made the scrub jungle on the south side. Keltner's vehicle did not slow. From the hilltop, the Dong Nai commander was making a different calculation. The air was working both sides of the road now with increasing precision. Major Stefanelli had placed his second white phosphorus rocket into a group of fighters already trying to move south, and the 3 F-100s were 90 seconds from their first bomb run. His escape route was still open, south to the railroad tracks, then along the bunker line trail into the base areas. His fighters positioned along the trail would provide cover against air attack long enough for the main body to clear. The window was open, but the window had edges, and those edges were moving. The relief force was coming from multiple directions. Troop B had been rolling since the opening minutes of the fight and was approaching from the east. Company D with its tanks, Troop C, the howitzer battery, all of them were moving toward Ap Hung Nghia. The geometry of the next hour was going to turn his killing zone into an encirclement if he waited. He had inflicted casualties. He had destroyed vehicles. He had demonstrated what he had come to demonstrate. He gave the withdrawal order. It was not a rout. The 274th Regiment fell back in the disciplined manner of a unit that had planned its exit as carefully as its entry. South to the railroad tracks, then along the trail under cover, using the prepared defensive positions to slow any American pursuit that came too quickly. They were professionals reading a fight that had not gone entirely to plan and making the correct call about when continuing would cost more than it returned. They did not know, as they moved south, that Lieutenant Stewart's element was racing toward the railroad tracks from the south. They had planned for American reaction. They had not fully planned for this specific convergence. Armored cavalry arriving from multiple directions simultaneously, faster than the timeline had assumed. On the road, Keltner found C-18's surviving crew in the tall grass north of the highway, protecting their critically wounded commander. A helicopter had them evacuated within minutes. He drove west, past the burned hulks, past the blocked trailers, past the evidence of what the morning had caused. The relief force was close. The killing zone, which had been designed to complete itself in minutes, had been open for nearly an hour. The battle was not over, but the math had changed. The 3 F-100 Super Sabres found the killing zone using the smoke. Their arrival was not the product of calculated design. It was the result of an air controller on a routine administrative flight who had seen the first burning truck, recognized what it meant, and immediately contacted the Blackhorse Operations Center to offer a pre-planned airstrike that had been arranged for a nearby South Vietnamese Army unit. The air liaison officer on duty, Air Force Ma J, Charles F. Post, took the offer without hesitation. By the time the jets reached Ap Hung Nghia, Major Stefanelli had already marked the western edge of the banana grove with a white phosphorus rocket from his observation aircraft, taking ground fire in the process, placing the second rocket into a group of fighters who had risen and were running south across the railroad tracks. He had enough fuel for a few more minutes. He used all of them. The first bomb run dropped 6 high-drag, 500-pound bombs at the western edge of the ambush. The second run was napalm, enemy troops in withdrawal along the southern trail, moving under the canopy. The third was a strafing pass with 20mm cannon fire along the trail itself, targeting fighters who were using the jungle cover to move south. The sound of the bombs reached the road as a pressure event, different in register from the sharp percussion of the recoilless rifles. Deeper, carrying the specific authority of ordnance that does not discriminate between positions and the men inside them. What the Dong Nai commander felt through the soles of his feet on the crest west of Ap Hung Nghia when the first 500-pound bomb landed in the banana grove was information that no radio report could replicate. A bomb detonating inside your prepared position communicates something immediate and unambiguous. The air is no longer looking for you. It has found you. He had prepared for aircraft. He had not prepared for this specific timing. Bombs within 8 minutes of the first shot, coming from jets that had not been assigned to this fight at all. He gave the final withdrawal order. Troop B arrived from the east while the jets were still working. Nearest to the scene when the first contact report reached the operations center, they had been rolling from the Long Bin staging area almost from the opening minutes. They came into the eastern end of the ambush from the road, immediately drawing fire from the Dong Nai rearguard. Fighters positioned specifically to delay a relief force while the main body withdrew south. Troop B fought through the killing zone in the herringbone formation, alternating movement and fire, encountering the enemy in groups that were small enough to defeat but disciplined enough to require commitment. The fight at this stage was no longer an ambush and its target. It was two forces in contact on the same road, and the one that had started the morning with every advantage was now fighting on ground of the other side's choosing. What nobody on the Blackhorse side knew, in those minutes while Troop B was working east to west and the jets were working the withdrawal routes, was whether the Dong Nai main body had already crossed the railroad tracks and disappeared into the trail system beyond. If they had, if the regiment had made it south before Lieutenant Stewart's element reached the crossing, the southern jaw of the cordon would close on nothing. Stewart was racing that timeline. Whether he would beat it was not yet clear. The answer came from the south, 20 minutes after the relief force arrived. Stewart's crew made contact with what proved to be the rear guard of the 274th Regiment crossing the tracks. Killed 2, captured a Chinese-made 57mm recoilless rifle. The main body had already crossed. The cordon was incomplete. The regiment had made it through, but the road had not fallen. That is the fact at the center of the outcome, and it is worth understanding clearly. The Dong Nai Regiment had designed a killing zone to destroy a convoy and close a highway. The convoy had not been destroyed. The highway had not been closed. The regiment had withdrawn earlier than its timeline required, because the rate at which the American response arrived had been faster than the plan assumed. And the rate of that response came directly from the training that told 9 escorts not to stop. It wasn't about firepower. The Dong Nai Regiment had better positions and had placed their weapons with precision. It wasn't about numbers. They had more infantry on the ground at the opening of the fight. What the Battle of Ap Hung Nghia came down to was something that doesn't appear in tables of organization. Whether the training that men had internalized in a drill hall in the United States would hold when the drill hall was replaced by a burning highway and the targets were real. It held, not without cost, not cleanly, but it held in the most specific way it needed to, in the hands of the men driving the burning vehicles, who had been told what to do often enough that doing it had become the path of least resistance even when every other signal said, "Stop." From the south side, the Dong Nai fighters moving along the bunker line trail were processing the gap between what had been planned and what had happened. The plan had been good. The positions had been sound. The execution had been professional. The adversary had simply refused to let the plan complete itself, had driven burning vehicles through the zone, had returned to a killing zone alone in a single ACAV, had called air in fast enough to catch the withdrawal. You cannot fully prepare for an adversary who has trained to treat the ambush as the signal to go faster. You can account for most reactions. You cannot always account for the specific one that someone practiced 1,000 times, and then, when the moment arrived, simply did. Both sides had shown on that road something that belongs to soldiers and not to the wars they are sent to fight. The capacity to continue past the point where continuation had a clean, rational argument behind it. The Dong Nai men had held their positions in wet November nights for days without compromising the ambush. The Blackhorse men had driven burning vehicles through a prepared killing zone and kept the guns working until the vehicles themselves couldn't. Neither of those things was small. Neither of them was simple. The squadron coiled around the ambush site on the night of November 20th. That is the military term for it, coil, and there is something accurate in the image it makes. Vehicles arranged in a defensive circle, guns facing outward, engines cooling in the dark. The burning hulks on the road were still warm. The smoke had thinned to a gray thread against the night sky. Along the highway shoulder, the destroyed trucks sat at the angles at which they had stopped dying, and the darkness settled around them with the particular indifference of terrain. 7 Americans had been killed that day. 8 were wounded. 2 ACAVs and 4 trucks were destroyed. 3 ACAVs and another tank severely damaged. The driver of C-18 died 400 meters west of the Banana Grove in a burning vehicle, having driven it back into the killing zone specifically so that the men in the grass behind him might have the seconds they needed to disappear into cover. He did not have a Medal of Honor citation attached to his name in the sources that document this battle. What he had was a decision he made in a moment, when the manual had run out of instructions, and he made it completely, without half measures. The men who had been in the grass behind C-18, who had watched it turn back toward the guns, knew what they owed to that decision. Some of them would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. The driver of C-13 survived. His vehicle had burned and exploded behind him on the highway. His gunner had been killed before he drove the ACAV out of the zone. He had driven wounded in a burning vehicle 1,500 meters past the end of the ambush and had then had to walk back in through the cooling aftermath to find his unit. The sources do not record what he said when he found them. Some things don't get recorded because there are no forms designed to hold them. Among the Dong Nai dead, 30 confirmed, found in the days of searching that followed, were men who had held their positions with discipline through wet November nights and done exactly what they had trained to do. Men who had believed in a plan that was well constructed and well executed, and had failed not through any error of commitment on their part, but through an adversary's refusal to perform the expected action at the expected moment. They had families on the other side of the border. They had reasons for being in those positions that were not simple and were not nothing. The 30 bodies found on the battlefield had the same specific weight that all bodies have after a fight. The weight of the distance between what they had been the day before and what they were now, and the weight of the people somewhere distant who did not yet know. The morning of November 21st came gray and quiet. The road surface was dry red laterite dust layered over with the residue of the night, a fine grit that settled into every surface, that collected in the folds of the men's sleeves and in the grooves of the ACAV tracks. Where C-18 had turned and driven back west, the tracks had pressed 2 parallel lines into the laterite. They were still there in the morning. The napalm residue from the tree line to the south carried something faintly sweet on the air. The particular combination of burned vegetation and accelerant that does not smell like anything else, and that some of the men present that morning would encounter again, years later, in entirely unrelated contexts, and would know immediately and specifically what it brought back. The huts that had housed the enemy's machine gun positions had burned out overnight, and their structural frames stood in the smoke, like a sketch of what they had been. In the tall grass on the north side of the road, the pressed shapes where men had lain for hours were still visible. Some of those pressed places had dried blood in them. The men who had been evacuated had left the outlines of their presence in the grass, and those outlines would hold for a day or two before the grass recovered. The men who searched the area the next morning noticed these things and filed them somewhere private and rarely talked about afterward. The run-it-through doctrine, the mantra that Keltner had absorbed until it sat in his hands instead of his head, had been tested at its fullest possible extension on November 20th. It had held. The holding of it had meant burning vehicles continuing. It had meant one ACAV driving back into a zone that had destroyed 2 others. It had meant 7 men not coming home. Keltner understood in the days that followed that the doctrine had been right, that trusting the training had been the correct instruction, that the alternative, stopping, waiting, giving the killing zone time to complete its design, would have produced a different and worse result. He understood all of this. Understanding it did not change how the highway looked in his memory in the years that followed. On Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, the squadron returned to the Blackhorse base camp. They had been on the ambush site since the 20th, searching the jungle, recovering equipment, completing the account of what the 4 days had cost. They came back on a holiday, which is the kind of timing that a war does not arrange and does not apologize for. National Highway 1 remained open. That was the operational result. That was what would be recorded. The other results were recorded in different places, in the specific way that men hold things that have no form designed to contain them. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to years. And the weight never got lighter. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment continued Operation Atlanta through December and into 1967. The road stayed open. 10 days after Ap Hung Nghia, the 1st Squadron fought another major engagement near Soi Cat, a second ambush attempt, a second convoy escort. The Dong Nai Regiment was not finished. Neither was the Blackhorse. What had happened on Highway 1 was not a resolution. It was the first data point in an accounting that would run for 4 more years. The regiment fought at Ap Bao Bang. It fought at Loc Ninh. It crossed into Cambodia in 1970. It accumulated operations whose names layered into a record of a kind of service that the country that sent them there would take a long time to know how to receive. By the assessments of the officers who studied the armored dimension of the Vietnam War, the 11th Armored Cavalry became one of the most effective regiment-level units of the conflict. That lives in the official record. What lives outside the official record is harder to catalog. The men who were in the ditches on Highway 1 on November 20th went home eventually. They returned to a country that did not, in 1967 or 1968, or the years that followed, have an organized way of receiving what they brought back. They sat at dinner tables and held jobs that had no connection to counter-ambush doctrine, and sometimes heard a sound at a wrong angle. A car backfiring, a door slamming, something dropped in the kitchen, and their bodies responded before their minds could interpose. They did not always have words for what they were responding to, because the words available in civilian life had not been designed to hold what Highway 1 had asked of them. Some of them talked about it eventually. Some never did. The ones who never did were not the ones who had forgotten. Keltner carried what the highway had given him, the way men carry things that become permanent features of their interior landscape. Present at specific angles of light, in specific silences, in the particular quality of the pause that follows certain kinds of loud things. The run-it-through doctrine, which had sat at the floor of his thinking on the morning of the 20th, did not leave him. It changed shape. What it had meant as a drill, push the column, trust the training, became, in the years after Vietnam, something more complicated and less resolvable. It had been right. The men who followed it had done what needed to be done, and some of them had died doing it. The rightness of the doctrine did not resolve the weight of the cost, and he came to understand, somewhere in the years after he came home, that it was not supposed to. Those two things, correct doctrine and the cost of its application, were not a contradiction to be resolved. They were a condition to be lived with, and he lived with it. The driver of C-18 did not come home. His family received the news on a timeline that has its own particular shape. Not the death in the moment, which is over, but the knowledge arriving at a kitchen table in a town where nothing had changed, where everything looked exactly as it had the day before he deployed. His name is in the records. His decision, the one he made alone in a burning vehicle on a Tuesday morning in November, is documented in the Army's official account of the battle as a verified fact. The account does not tell you what to feel about it. It doesn't need to. The men of the Dong Nai Regiment, who had made it south of the railroad tracks, rebuilt and continued fighting. The 5th Viet Cong Division remained active in 3 Corps, through the end of the American involvement and beyond. The fighters who had held their positions in the wet November nights and conducted their withdrawal with discipline went back into a war that lasted another 9 years after Ap Hung Nghia. What those 9 years asked of them is a different story. But the men who had been on the hilltop and in the banana grove, who had watched the burning ACAVs refuse to stop, they carried that knowledge too. Not as a defeat, necessarily, but as information about what a specific kind of adversary looks like when the training goes deep enough, and about what that kind of adversary costs itself in the process. Years later, somewhere in the particular geography of an ordinary life that has been permanently altered by an extraordinary one, a man who had been in a ditch on Highway 1 might find himself sitting with his back to a wall at a restaurant, not entirely sure why that felt necessary, and might understand, in the way you understand a thing that has no clean explanation, that the road was still in him, that the sound of the burning ACAV and the smell of the napalm residue and the pressed shapes in the grass were not memories in the usual sense. They were architecture. Part of the structure his experience had become. The highway remained open. The Blackhorse came home. The war went on without them, and then it ended in a way that complicated the simplest forms of accounting for what any of it had been for. those questions did not resolve. They became part of what the men carried, alongside everything else the highway had given them, and they carried it in the specific way that soldiers carry things that have no name in any manual, quietly, privately, for the rest of their lives. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences matter. Honor the warriors. Question the wars.